trace the origins and developments of the earliest civilizations, period. These being in Southwest Asia, or what's sometimes called the Middle East, and in Northeast Africa, in particular in Egypt. Southwest Asia, Northeast Africa, otherwise Middle East and Egypt. But first, let's take a minute to think about what exactly is civilization. How might we define that? Well, your book defines it as a complex culture in which large numbers of people share a variety of common elements. So, a complex culture in which large numbers of people share a variety of common elements. It's rare that I will give you like an actual definition like this, but I think it's useful here to define civilization as a complex culture in which large numbers of people share a variety of common elements. Well, that begs the question, though, of what exactly is culture? And how might we define that? And it has a few different meanings. What do we mean when we say a culture, though? We use that in that way. Probably we're talking about, when it comes to a particular people who would constitute a civilization, we're talking about customs, arts, social institutions, achievements, perhaps. Customs, arts, social institutions, achievements. Maybe patterns of action and behavior, even, of a particular people. We rely on archaeologists for our knowledge of these earliest civilizations for the most part, and so material objects would constitute elements of a culture that we can examine and interpret. So material objects meaning dwellings, people's clothing, the tools that they use, crafts that they made. So, what do we say? Customs, social institutions, arts, material objects, patterns of action and behavior. Well, also, too, what can we discern about a people's values or their beliefs? This would also constitute elements of culture. So, values and beliefs, material objects, patterns of action and behavior, customs, social institutions, arts and achievements, and so on. So, with that being said, what are the basic characteristics then of the earliest cultures? If we're talking about the Paleolithic era and then getting into the Neolithic era, what would be the basic characteristics of culture? Well, first of all, what do those words mean, Paleolithic and Neolithic? Anybody know? So, if you break it down, you've got lithic in there, and then paleo on one and neo on the other. So, you've got 1, 2, 3 elements there. What is it? Well, I mean, surely at least we could discern what neo might mean. No? All right. Old Stone Age and New Stone Age. Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, Neo is in New Stone Age. We're talking about 2 to 3 million years ago. And the basic characteristics of Stone Age culture or civilization would be the use of stone tools, hence the Stone Age. Archaeologists have unearthed stone tools from 3 million years ago and discerned that the use of these would mark the earliest beginnings of Paleolithic civilization. Also, tools of bone or wood, and eventually the use of copper to make certain tools. All elements of Old Stone Age civilization. So what then is the demarcation then? What develops to where we're talking about not Paleolithic but Neolithic era? What changes? What other elements of civilization would get us from the Old Stone Age to the New, might you guess? First of all, those peoples of the Paleolithic era were hunter-gatherers. They moved with herds of animals. They were not settled down in any one place. They were, in other words, nomadic peoples, or what you might call pastoral people. They moved according to where the herds of animals they were hunting went and gathered along the way. So what then might you guess would be the major demarcation or development from Paleolithic to Neolithic?
Living patterns.
There's going to be something that gets us to that. There's one major breakthrough that allows us to take into account that and so many other things.
Agriculture?
Yes. What we would call sedentary agriculture, or as you said, farming. And along with that, animal husbandry, or the domestication of animals. I don't mean like the domestication of your cat or your dog. I mean the use of oxen as beasts of burden, the use of horse or cattle, and so on. So sedentary means in one place. So the knowledge and the ability to settle down, to plant certain crops, and to grow and harvest those crops, and to be able to live off of that and stay in one place. And that unlocks your ability to do so many other things. To have, if you're able to do this successfully, have a surplus of crops. You don't need every single person engaged in that activity that allows other people to specialize in other things, or what we call the division of labor. So those are the major two developments of the Neolithic era, which would bring us up to about 3000 BCE and the dawn of the Bronze Age, wherein people began to make and use bronze tools, and then eventually iron tools. So they've developed the skills of metallurgy, in other words, the smelting of metals. And not only have they been able to settle down, but they have settled into, in some cases, large cities, like you see pictured there. They have organized governments of some kind. They probably have armies at their disposal for, at a minimum, defense, if not more. Archaeologists can discern that they had a social structure based on economic power or resources. As I said, there was probably then a division of labor, and there was probably production of goods for trade, and not just subsistence agriculture. Generally, probably some sort of organized or understood religion of some sort. In some cases, the development of systems of writing, generally for record keeping, for the purposes of trade or taxation, perhaps military administration. And then finally, in some cases, the production of sophisticated art or architecture in terms of dwellings, religious structures, and so on. These are all elements of Bronze Age civilization. Is that all making sense? So where do the first civilizations emerge? I mean, obviously, today, we're looking at the Middle East and Egypt. That would be two places. But we're also going to look at India. We're going to look at China. We will eventually cross over into the Western Hemisphere, and we'll eventually look at the rest of the African continent. But in terms of these first ones, in Egypt and Mesopotamia today, Harappa or India later, the Xia dynasty in China, there is something common to each and every one of those places. So here, Egypt, here, Mesopotamia, that's today, and then we'll go here to northwest India, and then here to central China. What is common to all four of those places?
There's little bare water.
Yep. Water, rivers. Earliest civilizations develop around rivers. Why would a river be important?
Water.
Yeah, okay. Why is water important?
Irrigation.
Yeah, I mean, not only do we need water to survive, to drink, as do the animals that you have domesticated, as do also other animals that would come to the water to drink that you could then kill and hunt and eat as meat, right? But also irrigation for farming, right? Or perhaps these rivers flood and deposit minerals into the surrounding soil that make it incredibly fertile. All of these reasons should allow for agricultural surplus, population growth, labor specialization, social hierarchy, and so on. All the things we talked about. Growth of a large city ruled over by a big man or a strong man, probably in place because of some religious status or military victories or both. Such certainly was the case in Mesopotamia. In fact, Mesopotamia is a name later given to this region by the Greeks. It means land between the rivers plural, for two rivers run somewhat parallel right through this region, from the Zagros Mountains in Anatolia to the Persian Gulf, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So up here would be the Zagros Mountains. This is Anatolia or modern-day Turkey. And the Tigris up here, the Euphrates down here, they run right through modern-day Iraq. Down here to the Persian Gulf of modern-day Kuwait, just above modern-day Saudi Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula. They carry snowmelt from the Zagros Mountains, and when they flood, sometimes unpredictably, but regularly nonetheless, when these rivers flood, they deposit silt onto the surrounding land, which is somewhat like, somewhere between like sand and clay. But it has minerals in it that then make the soil that had been flooded incredibly fertile for farming, particularly if you could control that flooding and develop rudimentary irrigation systems by building a series of canals, as these people are able to do. This area is sometimes known as the Fertile Crescent, in fact. And if you will indulge me, and those of you that know me know that I am wont to do this from time to time, to the point of ridicule by friends and colleagues. Why do you spend so much time on Google Earth? Because it's important to me. But I don't want you to look at this. I mean, even modern day satellite imagery, you can discern that the surrounding area is desert, and yet look how fertile the land of this Fertile Crescent, with the Tigris River up here and the Euphrates down here. This is modern day Iraq, from Baghdad to Basra and to Kuwait. Incredibly fertile region then, now, and always. And it was there, down here in the southeastern portion of the Fertile Crescent, that arose the city-states of the Sumerians, Sumer. Peoples who lived in city-states like Uruk, which a rendering of what it might well look like is pictured there at bottom right. And the names of these cities, I don't know if you can see or not, but there is Uruk, U-R-U-K. Walled cities, for defense, of course, which controlled the agrarian countryside around them. So, this is circa 3000 BCE or so. What does that mean, BCE?
Before Common Era.
Before Common Era. This is when Christian historians laid out the years of the calendar, it was BC and AD, as in before Christ, and Anno Domini, or the year of our Lord. And secular scholars have subsequently kept the same numbering system, but now maintained the BC as before Common Era, and CE as Common Era. That would be the typical secular scholarly breakdown of this. But we count down in BCE to 0, and then begin in CE counting up from 1 to where we are now, 2021. Does that make sense? So we've been counting down to 3000 BCE to get to the Sumerians, who lived in dwellings of mud brick. Dwellings that could be made of mud that could be built of bricks of mud that had been dried in the sun. And we know there was a social structure because archaeologists who have dug in these sites have found that there were small dwellings for presumably peasant types or maybe craftsman type people, and then larger dwellings for presumably government functionaries, religious officials. We know that they had made use of the arch and the dome in many of these dwellings, so the architecture is sophisticated. Most sophisticated of all were the ziggurats, which you can see as ziggurat in this rendering right in the middle there. You see it? So these are giant towers, relatively giant for the time, and fairly impressive, all things considered. Giant towers atop which there was a temple dedicated to the gods, who were thought to own these cities. And the big man, elite, strongman ruler only ruled with the pleasure of, the blessing of the gods, and was propped up by, or got legitimacy through military victories and the approval of religious functionaries, priests or priestesses, who themselves were important and wealthy individuals, we believe. These city-states were probably theocracies of sorts. That is, there was some sort of government by or through religion. Certainly using religion for justification of power. And priests who used divination, something we'll talk about in a little bit more detail when it comes to China, where there also is a sort of quasi-religious legitimacy system for dynasties there. But divination would be examining certain material things if you're a priest or priestess to determine some sort of predicted outcome. And in this case, it might be like goat livers. As we'll see in China, it will be bones that will be examined by religious officials to determine what might be the outcome of this year's harvest, what might be the outcome of a military campaign, and so on. The religion was, I said gods plural, so it was polytheistic, as in not just one god, but many gods, that were thought to control certain elements of life on earth, be it the harvest or floods. And as I mentioned, the flooding of the Tigris and the Euphrates were not regular, it was unpredictable. So you use divination to find out what the gods were going to do in terms of the flooding this year. And the weather would be an obvious other element of life on earth that would be thought to be controlled by the gods. In terms of economy and society, of course, the vast majority of people living in the Sumerian city-states were engaged in farming outside of the city walls. So mostly we're talking agriculture, but not just for subsistence, over and above that and for trade. And there were craftsmen and artisans. They had clay pottery and bronze tools and other implements. They had beer. That was something, right? Of course, one of the main things that early sedentary people would have engaged in growing would be certain grains, so it stands to reason they might have pretty early figured out how to ferment and create alcohol. In terms of trade, they had wheeled carts to transport goods, and we know they traded over a vast area that stretched all the way from India to the eastern Mediterranean. And anytime you have trade, you have merchants who are going to make money off that, and so they have an elevated place in society. We know in addition to that, we've already said that we know there were certain elites, government officials, religious officials, mostly farmers, but some craftspeople. Slaves there were. They had developed writing, a system of writing known as cuneiform, where they used these handheld reeds, almost like a pencil, to make wedge-shaped symbols on clay tablets. Cuneiform denotes wedge-shaped. Symbols on clay tablets that would, while they're wet, that would then dry. These wedge-shaped symbols were to represent sounds of speech. So this is a phonetic form of writing. Probably used for record keeping in the temples and the palace, used in trade and business, of course, perhaps used in terms of military record keeping. But also, this is taking it a step farther, poetry, storytelling. You're going to read a small part of the Epic of Gilgamesh for quiz 1. An epic poem that is a very long and dramatic poem, not just a few lines or stanzas, but a story that tells the heroic deeds of a legendary king of Uruk and a great flood. Epic of Gilgamesh, which you will read, which I probably should have had out here for you. Oops, I do that every time. Every time. There you go. Well, in the late 2000s BCE, beginning around 2300 BCE, people from the north of these Sumerian city-states, farther up north in the Fertile Crescent, towards Syria and Anatolia, the Akkadian peoples marched south under the command of a leader named Sargon, who commands a very large army and overruns the city-states of Sumeria and establishes among the world's first dynastic empires. The Akkadians conquer the Sumerians, and rule over that region for several hundred years. The descendants of Sargon, so again, among the first dynastic empires in world history.
What is dynastic?
Dynastic meaning leadership passed from Sargon to his heirs, to his children and his children's children. Good question. We will see a similar system in China. In fact, a much more, in some ways, a more sophisticated dynastic system with a particular kind, I should say, of legitimacy. So that'll be the China lecture here in a week or so. But other questions? So this Akkadian Empire lasts till about 2100 BCE, so a couple of hundred years, until it collapses under attack from neighboring hill peoples, and there's a return then to the city-state system. You see this in Mesopotamia. This is a pattern of there's an empire of X fill-in-the-blank peoples from whatever corner of this region for a brief period of time, a few hundred years. It collapses. You go back to a series of warring or competing city-states until the next people from the other corner rise up and rule over as a dynastic empire and so on. For example, the next to do this is Hammurabi from Babylon, who reigns in the 1700s BCE, builds an empire in the region with its capital at that city of Babylon, which, if you could see, I keep saying I'm going to do this. I'm going to pull all the shades down, make them come, and try to brighten this projector up. Uruk, I pointed out, is down here, roundabouts where the modern-day city of Basra would be, but Babylon is farther up the Euphrates River, up here towards where the modern city of Baghdad would be, a little bit further up. But there is Babylon. Hammurabi had a massive army with axes, spears, copper and bronze daggers. He was able to overrun the city-states of Akkad and Sumer, Acadia and Samaria, and establish an empire that's best known perhaps for the law code or the legal code that Hammurabi sets out. One of the more sophisticated legal codes of ancient times, Code of Hammurabi, in his attempt to, quote, portray himself as a source of justice to his people. Source of justice, not just power. Hammurabi's code is generally understood to operate under the concept of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. A concept which finds its way into the Hebrew Bible, fundamental text of Judaism that is also fundamental to Christianity and Islam. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That is the notion that the punishment should fit in some way the crime. What's interesting, though, is that really isn't the case in the Law Code of Hammurabi. If you look at it, and I don't recall if I've assigned a portion of the text that has some examples. I can't remember if I did or not, but I think they're in there. And you look at these examples, and you can see that the punishment actually varies for the same crime depending on your social status and your gender. So we remember it in this way, and it finds its way into those fundamental Abrahamic texts, but it really wasn't the principle by which even the code itself operated. The punishment varied depending on, in other words, if you were poor or if you're a woman, you were more liable to be punished more harshly for the same crime as if you were wealthy or a man. Questions about any of this?
You said there was a city-state in between the Akkadian Empire and the Babylonian?
Say it again.
You said there were city-states.
Yeah, so there always, this region has been, well, during the ancient times, it was always a collection of city-states and surrounding agricultural countryside. But between these periods, like here And here, when we can say, okay, it was ruled over by Sargon and his descendants, the Akkadian Empire. Okay, it was ruled over by Hammurabi briefly as a Babylonian empire. Those empires will collapse, and then there's no central authority to sort of rule over everybody, and it's just competing city-states. Does that make sense? We'll see something similar when we get to Greece, where there are not many times where the entirety of Greece is ruled over by a leader from one particular city-state. It's competing city-states like Athens and Sparta and so on. So power is more diffuse as opposed to centralized. So there's what it looked like during the Akkadian Empire period. You can see they ruled over a significant portion of the Fertile Crescent from nearly the Zagros Mountains all the way through down to the Persian Gulf. And indeed have made raids apparently on areas to the northwest and up the upper reaches of the Tigris. This would be during the time of the first Babylonian Empire. Confusingly, there will be a Neo-Babylonian Empire a little bit later, which is, I'll say that. There's no need to be more confusing than it already is. So, other peoples we'll talk about. Here's the Babylonian Empire, which stretched from Assyria up here down to the Persian Gulf, all the Sumerian city-states ruled over by the leaders here in Babylon. The Hittites up here will come up. The Hyksos will come up. This eventually will be known as Canaan. This is modern-day Syria. We're about to move over here, though, to Egypt. Here's some examples of cuneiform. See the wedge-shaped markings. And there is a bronze rendering of Sargon, ruler of the Akkadians. Let's move to Egypt, though, and here the river, of course, is the Nile. Egyptian civilization develops because of the Nile River. The longest river in the world, which flows south to north, backwards looking, if you will. Thousands of miles from Nubia or the Sudan all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea. And provides its valley with the stuff of life. This area has a sort of natural isolation which, depending on who you were in Mesopotamia, you maybe did not have, as you had those different competing peoples, Akkadians and Sumerians and Assyrians and Babylonians. Here you have the river. It's all desert outside of the river valley. The river, as with the Tigris and Euphrates, floods. Only in this case of the Nile, it floods regularly in the early fall months, so you know when it's coming. You don't have that unpredictability. Easier to tame, easier to make use of. But similar to the Tigris and Euphrates, it floods and leaves silt, minerals that strengthen the soil for cultivation. But think about it. You've got desert to the west, desert to the east, the Nile Delta up here where the Nile spills out, branches out into the Mediterranean. And then up here, as you get up into the upper reaches where the Nile begins, down here towards Nubia, there are cataracts, rapids, which are impassable, that form a sort of barrier to the south. So you have natural physical barriers all around you, protecting you from any potential outside invaders. But we refer to that delta area where the mouth of the Nile is as Lower Egypt, and further south is Upper Egypt, which is confusing. As you look at an image, a two-dimensional image, you think upper would be up here and lower down here, but remember the river runs or flows that way. So it begins in the upper reaches here and flows that way. In this case, being fed, as you know, we talked about the Tigris and Euphrates being fed by the snow melt of the Zagros Mountains. In this case, the river is fed by the rains of Central Africa. I want you to look at, and there's an image, of course, but again, I'm going to Google Earth you. I mean, it's even more profound in this case. Look at that. That's satellite imagery. And when I say it's desert on either side, I mean it is desert on either side. This is the delta, most populous region of nation-state of Egypt today. We'll talk about when the Greeks invade Egypt later. Alexander the Great establishes Alexandria, one of the great cities. There is Cairo.
What's the scale on that?
What's that?
What's the scale on it? Like, how big is it?
That is a great question. Looks like that says 20 miles. Is this? So you're looking at over 100-mile wide delta there. The great ancient cities would be those of Memphis. So Memphis, Tennessee has a mother city. Memphis and Thebes. There's roundabout where Memphis would have been, right at the, we're just about where the delta begins. And Thebes, I don't know if we're going to get a modern day. Yeah, okay. Would have been right about here, so much farther up. You can see it begins here in the rainforests of Central Africa there, flows north, but just incredibly fertile then, now, and always, as I said, with the Fertile Crescent. So, early Egyptian civilization develops in what we call the Old Kingdom period, which then would give way to a Middle Kingdom period. These would run from about 2500 BCE to about 1600 BCE. Periods of profound stability and prosperity, and in the Old Kingdom period, that's when you see the building of the first great pyramids. When the capital was at Memphis, and I just showed you, in the upper and lower Nile regions were united and ruled over by one pharaoh. Pharaoh, or a king, that was seen as godlike, like a demigod, a quasi-god, not quite a god, but close. And the Egyptians' religion was polytheistic too, but what connected, we'll see something similar when we get to China. I know I keep saying that. But one of the goddesses was Maat, capital M-A-A-T, Maat. But lowercase Maat there is like a concept of order or justice and harmony that Egypt and its peoples and the person of the Pharaoh, him or herself occasionally, were thought to possess. If they were doing things right and as they should, there would be Maat, or social justice and harmony and order, as the goddess capital M Maat would have it. What are the pyramids built for? What do they function as? It's not quite like with the ziggurats where there's a temple on top to the gods. They're tombs, exactly. They're tombs for the pharaohs in the afterlife. And the bodies of these pharaohs would be mummified and entombed in these great massive pyramids and surrounded by all kinds of fineries and nice things. The idea being that you have a physical body, but you also have a spiritual body, a ka, K-A, ka. That if everyone did what they were supposed to do in this process, and you had lived as you should, your ka ought to come back and continue to live, your spiritual self. And if that were to be the case, inside the tomb, you'd want there to be, a lot of nice shit in there. Got to have nice living for the ka in the afterlife. And so there's all kinds of wealth found in some of these pyramids. Let's see. Particularly those at Giza. To test my ability to find stuff. I think we've pretty much found it here. Oh, that was a little off. Just drop ourselves down into wherever. I think that's not a great angle. I mean, it's surrounded by desert, of course, so you can see these things for miles and miles and miles away. Keep doing that. On the other side. There we go. That's better. Yeah. Thousands of years old. And surrounded by flat desert. There we go. That's better. Tour buses, of course. I mean, this is what they look like after thousands of years of erosion, of course, so you can imagine. Here's the Sphinx. There it is. Oh, what's up, man? Hey, dude. They really went out of their way to protect this guy's privacy. Although that's his photograph. Okay, that's not just the Google Earth. So. Everybody taking pictures. We just got inside a structure of some sort on accident. There it is. So you got 1, 2, 3 pyramids, and there's the Sphinx. That's our money shot for now. So. Right. So I spoke of mummification. Let me just read from your textbook here. Obviously, no need to write this down. But this is from an ancient Greek historian who visited Egypt around the 5th century BCE. The most refined method of mummification, and note this is the most refined, meaning there's got to be like less refined ways of doing it that are more disturbing. First of all, they draw out the brain through the nostrils with an iron hook. Off to a good start. That's again, the most refined method. Then they make an incision in the flank with a sharp Ethiopian stone through which they extract all the internal organs, liver, lungs, stomach, intestine, placed in 4 special jars that were put in the tomb with the mummy. Priests covered the corpse with a natural salt that absorbed the body's water, and later they filled the body with spices and wrapped it with layers of linen soaked in resin. And at the end of the process, which took about 70 days, a lifelike mask was placed over the head and shoulders of the mummy, which was then sealed in a case and placed in its tomb. And Again, the pyramids were tombs for the mummified bodies of the pharaohs, the largest and most magnificent of which were built under King Khufu, constructed at Giza. Those are the ones we were just looking at. Famous Great Pyramid covers 13 acres, measures 756 feet at each side of its base, and stands 481 feet high. And oh, by the way, its four sides are almost precisely oriented to the 4 points of the compass. Did you notice that? Forgot to point that out. We're looking at it on Google Earth. We're oriented perfectly northwest, southeast, straight up, and it is dead square. So, now, obviously, there's no accident either. In some of these tombs are hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics were a form of writing, but not as with cuneiform phonetic. These are instead pictographs. Hieroglyphics is Greek for priest carvings or sacred writings. They're pictographs, that pictures that correspond with things or ideas. Found in the temples and tombs, presumably to assist in honoring the gods or helping the Ka, the spirit, get to the afterworld. And by the way, the pyramids and these temples and all of this wealth and adornment is just a testament to a symbol of the sheer power of the pharaohs and the wealth that they commanded and the ability to marshal the labor back then to accomplish something like that is profound. There is a period of decline, though, briefly, which would eventually give way to a third and final New Kingdom period. It emerges about 1500 BCE. The capital would be Thebes, which I pointed out earlier. This New Kingdom Egypt has a much more militaristic posture. This is more of an expansionist Egypt, not content to simply unite Upper and Lower Nile into one, but to perhaps branch out and try to rule over an empire beyond the Nile Delta and River Valley. And a new line of pharaohs restores Egypt to its great power and wealth and even beyond. No longer a threat were the Hyksos from the Arabian Peninsula. No longer a threat would be the Nubians down south in the upper reaches of the Nile. They would build a great empire and conquer parts of those areas. For they had learned from the Hyksos that had invaded Egypt at the end of the Middle Kingdom period certain ways of war. They learned how to use copper tools and weapons. They had adopted the use of the horse-drawn chariot in warfare from the Hyksos. They had learned how to make iron weapons from the Hyksos, iron farming implements, which could make for greater agricultural surplus. They built an empire that stretched from Canaan, or modern-day Israel and Palestine, and Syria to the northeast, into Libya to the west, and below the fourth cataract of the Nile into, as I said, Nubia to the south. Into the lands of those peoples who had come into and rampaged through Egypt in between the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom period. Noted pharaohs of this period. Well, there was Amenhotep, who becomes Akhenaten, who actually, if you read in your book in this section, you see that he had tried to make some religious changes. There were a variety. I mentioned this polytheistic religion, and so multiple gods and goddesses like Isis and Osiris and Ra, the sun god. Amenhotep tried to just focus on one particular god, Aten, at the expense of all other gods. And look, for each god, there were all kinds of temples and priests and such that were focused on that other god. And so he's slighting these people trying to deprive them of their influence, and they didn't much like it. And he even moves the capital to this brand new city, changes his name, as I mentioned. But that turns out to be a catastrophic failure, and all of that was reversed upon his death. For his son was Tutankhamun, King Tut, who ruled as a boy pharaoh, but it was the people around him serving as his regents that encouraged him to reverse everything that his father had done and go back to the old ways. So his reign is significant for that. But does anybody know why else is it that King Tut, as he's called in the West, has this sort of mythical significance? Or at least it did, and sort of captivated the Western imagination for many, many decades. Say it again. About how he died? Yeah, because he dies young, right? And so the story of his life is captivating too, which people begin to explore in more detail. And let me not screw up the year here. In 1922, archaeologists, Indiana Jones type folks out there doing the real stuff, they found his tomb completely intact. Over many centuries, a lot of these tombs and pyramids got raided by grave robbers, right? But King Tut's didn't, and in 1920, can you imagine being that archaeologist, like, okay, I've made the greatest discovery of all time. No one will ever top this. I can retire and die in total satisfaction and peace. And I forget the guy's name, but they discovered Tutankhamun's tomb completely intact with his mummified body in there and the burial mass that you see right there, which is, I think, probably in the museum in Alexandria. Some of these things were taken from Egypt that have been subsequently repatriated in the last half century or so. But I mentioned all the kind of fineries they adorn these tombs with, so it was just an absolute mega find. And so Tutankhamun has this elevated position in our minds, partly because of that. There's also the Ramses II, who builds massive new temples, the likes of which Egypt had never seen, giant statues of himself, glorifying himself for having taken Canaan from the Hittites and made other imperial gains. So he's kind of one of the great conqueror pharaohs. And then there's Hatshepsut, who is a woman pharaoh, who went by His Majesty and took all of the pomp and titles and circumstance that came along with being the pharaoh, including building a gigantic temple, which we're going to go see. It's further up the Nile, but I'm not totally confident in my ability to find it. Leading up, and it's built into the side of the cliffs here. Pretty awesome. It's also cool, you can just kind of waltz on up, waltz right on in. Oh, they do have, okay, there is finally a barrier there. The mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, great woman pharaoh. Questions?
What was her role like?
More or less benevolent. Reigns over the great empire that had been built by pharaohs previous. Not racked by any scandal or anything. Certainly no kind of scandalous religious changes like those undertaken by Amenhotep. I think the grandiosity of that mortuary temple is a testament to the success of her reign. There would be a horse-drawn chariot warrior, and again, the Egyptians learned to adopt that mode of war from the Hyksos. And there is an aerial view of the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut.
Did she just build that as a tomb for herself instead
Yeah.
of a pyramid? Or
Yes, yeah, in lieu of a pyramid, and you know, frankly, I do not know what would be the rationale for that kind of temple in lieu of the old style pyramid, just a new thing. But I'm sure there's more to it than that. But yes, that was the purpose. So just a brief. Here we are on the ancient civilization timeline. Ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, as in Sumer, mid 3000s BC or BCE. Old Kingdom, Egypt, developing around 3200 BC. And then we'll move next time into Harappan civilization in India, and then to early civilizations in China. But we're about to briefly talk about the ancient Israelites. But first, the Phoenicians. Where are we, time-wise? We don't have too much longer. With the decline of the Hittites in Anatolia and then the New Kingdom Egypt around the same time, rose the Phoenicians in the area of Canaan, sometimes called the Levant, there on the eastern Mediterranean. These were peoples who were adept at controlling trade from the west and the east into and out of the Mediterranean Ocean. And just for reference sake, we're talking about this area here, where modern-day Palestine, Israel, and Lebanon would be. So the Phoenicians rise there and display great ability to marshal trade coming into and out of that area from west and east, and traded goods as far away as the west coast of Africa, even to the islands of Britain, and established throughout that area colonies, including as far away as Spain. And the most famous of which was established, now I'll keep bouncing around. So here is Canaan, Phoenicians are. This is the Mediterranean. They established a colony as far away as southern Spain here, but the most famous of which was established right around here, modern-day Tunisia, and that is Carthage. Because Carthage later becomes an independent empire all its own that would later challenge Rome. So Carthage is kind of the legacy colony, if you will, of the Phoenicians. Their most important contribution, notice, to civilization is the Phoenician alphabet. Moving beyond pictographs or signs to represent words, syllables, and developing instead 22 characters to represent the sounds of their speech. Letters that could be combined to spell any word. Now, the Phoenicians themselves are later conquered by the Assyrians and later the Persians, as we'll see. But their alphabet ends up being the basis for the Greek alphabet, which is, of course, the basis for the Roman alphabet, which becomes the alphabet of the language of Latin, from which we get Italian, Spanish, French. French becomes a major part of English, and so on. So this is the alphabet that we use. And you can look in this little graph here and see the development from original Phoenician into Greek and Roman. talk then finally about the Hebrews, the Jews, who rise south, just south of where the Phoenicians are, and who write down their tradition, their history, the story of their origins. It becomes a significant portion of what's the Hebrew Bible, the fundamental text of Judaism. What later becomes the Old Testament of the Christian Bible and forms a significant portion of the Quran, the holy text of Islam. Now, the actual truth of large portions of the story has been put under question by historians. We think there are some elements of it that probably were more or less true, and others that were legendary or made up later. But as the story goes, the Hebrews are descended from the great patriarch Abraham, migrant to the region of Mesopotamia, who was promised the land of Canaan by God, making it therefore the promised land, and making them the children of Israel, descendants of Abraham. They become the Israelites, whom drought forces them to migrate at one point, so the story goes, to Egypt, where they were enslaved as laborers on building projects like here. Enslaved in Egypt. But so the story goes, they were led out of Egypt, migrate out, in other words, an exodus from Egypt, led by a probably mythical character known as Moses, who wanders around with them in the desert until he ultimately finds that promised land of Canaan again. And then supposedly the mighty King David unites the tribes of Israel into a unified kingdom in 1000 BCE, defeating along the way the neighboring enemy Philistines, uniting all of Canaan under his rule. And his son, Solomon, is said to have built the first temple at Jerusalem, which becomes the physical heart of the Jewish kingdom, the temple on the hill at Jerusalem. At one point, though, the supposedly once unified kingdom under David and Solomon is split into a kingdom of Israel in the north and a kingdom of Judah to the south. And between 700 and 500 BCE, each of those was conquered, the kingdom of Israel being conquered by the Assyrians, and the kingdom of Judah being conquered by the neighbors of the Assyrians, known as the Chaldeans. Do I have that on there? We've moved on. I'm sorry. Kingdom of Israel conquered by the Assyrians. Kingdom of Judah conquered by the Chaldeans. The Chaldean kingdom or empire is actually it's like a Neo-Babylonian empire. The city-state of Babylon in that region all being ruled over by a ruler named Nebuchadnezzar, whose name you don't have to know because it's not on there. But they're able to create a new empire with a capital at Babylon, and they're just known historically as the Chaldeans, who destroy, by the way, Jerusalem and its temple, and many of Jerusalem's people from Judah, then these Jews, are exiled to Babylon, back to Babylon, ushering in the period then known as the Babylonian captivity. When Babylon, again under Nebuchadnezzar, becomes briefly one of the great cities of the ancient world, until it's conquered by the Persians. And then to the north of them in the purple, you can see there is a new Assyrian empire ruled over by a series of kings that you see listed there on the map, the Tiglath-Pileser and others. Confusingly, another ruler named Sargon, who has absolutely no connection to the Sargon of Acadia we looked at in the very, very beginning. But the Persians sort of swoop in and conquer much of this entire area, reaching even into Egypt, as I alluded to earlier, under the great conquering Kings Cyrus and Darius. They conquered the Phoenicians, they conquered Babylon. They let the Jews return to Judah. They bring with them a monotheistic religion known as Zoroastrianism. Persia, by the way, is to the east of all that. So if you're looking at where Babylon and Assyria are, to the right or to the east lies Persia, modern-day Iran. But they bring with them Zoroastrianism, a monotheistic religion that may well have had certain influences on Christianity in terms of its ideas of a good and evil spirit, of free will to choose between good and evil, of the idea of your soul either achieving paradise or an eternal torment, i.e. like hell in the Christian theology. But monotheistic too was the religion that developed eventually among the Hebrews of the Jews, and that is Judaism, which settles on belief in only one God. A God who was just, but who expected obedience, who had made a covenant with the Jewish people that said they would receive his protection if they did right by him, including following commandments as laid out by Moses, right? Thou shalt not do X, Y, Z. The covenant at its core was obedience to the law for God's protection. The fundamental belief of this monotheistic religion that is Judaism, which of course later there would come a man seen as a radical leader of a particular Jewish sect known as Jesus, later known as Jesus Christ, to his followers, whose followers would develop the institutional religion known as Christianity. And then still later from that, there would come a man who claims to have had revelation from God that he is the last and final prophet of that one single God, and that man is Muhammad, and the religion that his followers build is Islam. These are all Abrahamic religions. They all trace their lineage to Abraham, who is considered a prophet in all three of those religions, as are others, including Jesus Christ, or Jesus as of Nazareth, not considered the Messiah in Islam, but nonetheless considered a prophet. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about Christianity. We'll talk about Islam. I just want to say those are the three, as we call them, Abrahamic religions. Y'all let me go over. I'm sorry. That's it. No more. Whatever there was left to, just not going to do. So I feel bad. All right.